Welcome everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled that you're able to join us for what promises to be a thought-provoking and engaging event. It is a great honor to have Ambassador Dr. Mzukisi Qobo at the University of Manchester. He will be speaking about the World Trade Organization in a changing global order. In many respects, it would be difficult to think of a more timely moment for this particular address. The recent regime change in the USA and the policy announcement from the second Trump administration, along with the ongoing tariff disputes involving Mexico, Canada, and the European Union, mean that today's theme could not be more topical or higher on the agenda for both experts and the general public. It is also an inescapable reality that we are living in an era of immense and seemingly constant geopolitical changes, all of which have an impact on trade and commerce, as well as on every other aspect of life and interaction for human beings around the globe. In the 21st century, decisions made in parliaments, offices, or conferences in one continent can have immediate and life-altering consequences for individuals quietly living their lives on another, with thousands of miles of land and ocean between them, as well as what is often a vast gulf in culture, language, experience, and circumstances. In light of this, it is both natural and appropriate that governments and international law seek to influence and regulate interactions with such far-reaching consequences. Although the realms of diplomacy and international law are distinct, in practical terms their operation is interdependent. Diplomatic dynamics can only be adequately understood in light of the way that the states mobilize international law to advance their positions and projects. Equally, the real-world operation of international law is inseparable from the diplomatic processes that shape it. This is a dynamic that I find personally fascinating, as my own studies in a constitutional and domestic setting have focused very much on the need to understand the context within which law functions. I am powerfully convinced that any attempt to study law in a doctrinal vacuum, closeted away in an ivory tower, is doomed to fail, at least when it comes to achieving a nuanced understanding of its implications. Without this appreciation of law in the wild, as opposed to captive in textbooks, articles, and theories, legal academics have little hope of contributing to society beyond the university. I am pleased to say that the University of Manchester has always prided itself on a commitment to be outward-facing and humanly engaged in this regard, and the newly launched MILC Law Diplomacy Forum is an excellent example of this. This initiative seeks to bridge the divide between law and diplomacy, bringing a series of presentations that will feature diplomats and government officials working on issues of socio-economic and political inequalities at international, regional, and transnational levels. The work is led by Dr. Justina Uriburu, Professor Jen Conjudo, and Dr. Emma Nine, and I could not be more grateful for their energy and passion and dedication in bringing this about. Furthermore, the inauguration of this series was supported by the business engagement and knowledge exchange at the University of Manchester, and we are all extremely appreciative of this. However, our special thanks on this occasion, of course, goes to Ambassador Qobo. We are fully aware of the demands that he has on his time and the critical nature of his work. So it is a genuine honor that he has made a space to share his perspective and expertise with us on this occasion. His profile makes clear why he is in such a strong position to bring an insightful perspective to the topic of the World Trade Organization in a changing global order. As most of you will know, he is South Africa's ambassador and permanent representative to the World Trade Organization. He is also a visiting professor at the Wits School of Governance, University of the Witwatersrand. He previously served as the head of the Wits School of Governance and was a member of President Cyril Ramaphosa's Economic Advisory Council from 2019 to 2024. In addition, Ambassador Qobo holds a PhD from the University of Warwick, an MA from Stellenbosch University, and a BA from the University of Cape Town. He's someone very accustomed to dialogue in the scholarly, as well as the diplomatic sphere, and is a published author, most notably of the political economy of China-US relations, digital futures, and African agency, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2022. What a profile. Hopefully, this brief overview has given you some insight into our fantastic speakers' expertise. And as mentioned at the outset, I am utterly delighted on behalf of Law at the University of Manchester that you can be with us today to share your thoughts on a theme that is of relevance not only to the present moment, but one that will have ongoing repercussions for literally the entire global population. So, without further ado, I will hand over the floor to our distinguished guest, Ambassador Qobo. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that very generous and kind introduction. I would like to also express a special thanks to my friend and a long-time collaborator, Professor Yengo Odu. Also, as we were planning the trip, there were also individuals who were really great, putting it all together and supporting an easy transit from Geneva to Manchester. And I really want to thank Justina and Emma for their responsiveness and their support. Now, as we all know by now, the world has changed in really dramatic fashion, especially in the past 25 days since the inauguration of President Donald Trump in his second coming. I think it's important to underline that America has suffered a crisis of confidence long before Trump became president. Many scholars back in the late 70s have written about America's decline. There was even a reference to declinism, and this was more so in the 90s and the early 2000s with the rise with the ascendance of China as a global trading power, as a trading nation, quickly overtaking Japan and Germany, and also overtaking the US in scientific publication and patents filing. In my previous work, I rather characterize this tension between the US and China as largely about knowledge, as a contest aimed at knowledge. So it's a tussle over knowledge, which country dominates the commanding heights of knowledge, and this really draws on some of the work of Suzanne Strange and others who have written about the sources of power. I'm not going to delve deep into that. I want to try and map the outlines of the ongoing geopolitical tensions in the world to the extent they affect the functioning, the character and possible futures of the multilateral trading system as embodied in the World Trade Organization. So I don't have slides, so don't focus there. So I kind of preferred this to be a bit more interactive. Domestically, I think when the troubles faced by the US became more manifest, more glaring, I think many would trace this to the global financial crisis, the 2007, 8, 9 global financial crisis. And this was at the point when China and the US were in a very difficult dance over trade and intellectual property, environmental standards, in the main, and there was a strategic dialogue that brought the two powers together, anchored by the two presidents, and with Hank Paulson, who was, I think, the Treasury Secretary at the time, a prime mover in shaping this strategic dialogue. And it managed to extract some concessions from China at the time, and try to persuade China to be what Robert Zulik called a responsible international stakeholder. Some concessions on intellectual property issues, and China was learning from the US in many ways. You would recall that a team consisting of Hank Paulson and others went back to China to support some of the efforts to build or to support the business school at Tsinghua. So there was a really deep relationship between the two powers on how to manage the evolving global order, because it was becoming clear at the time that China would play a very important role in the global economic system, and the US was very keen to obtain China's acquiescence to the liberal international order. This relationship shifted significantly during the global financial crisis, because all of a sudden it became clear that the US was not the steady and most good-looking, faultless partner that China thought it was. It was not a power without flaws, and the global financial crisis revealed some of the underbelly of the America's financial system, and China was quite intent to chart its own course of development. And I think for the first time a realization dawned that China could propel itself into a global power in its own right, build its own institutions, global institutions, and court other countries that it could work with on multiple theaters. And this, of course, was expressed in the establishment of Asia's infrastructure bank, I think around close to 2016, but after the crisis. China's active involvement in the BRICS, the Belt and Road Initiative, all of these Chinese institutions announcing its confidence and its commitment to internationalize its global profile. Now, the US, meanwhile, continued to face serious strains in its domestic economy. And I make some of these observations in the work that the book that was referred to earlier, where you saw the US over time slacking in innovation and productivity, the US suffering multiple gaps in its social security. Some sectors within the US economy, especially the communities in the Rust Belt, the old industrial sectors of the economy, falling behind as new finance and tech sectors became magnets of wealth accumulation, especially the tech sectors in Silicon Valley. And of course, Silicon Valley has a long history, mainly in the 1970s. But you saw a blossoming of the new tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, and the booming wealth in this area in Seattle and in parts of Boston, and this juxtaposed against socioeconomic exclusion, especially of the sorts of communities that I referred to. in the Rust Belt and elsewhere. And these became constituencies that I think shifted the tempo of politics in the US. And constituencies that politicians of a certain hue, of Trump's hue, were able to connect with, were able to develop a vocabulary that connects with these communities. And there was a framing of America's problems as largely rooted in the state of the global economy. In the main, the rise of globalization of trade, the offshoring and outsourcing, and less about a self-assessment, a self-critique of America's own failure to invest significantly in innovation, to invest significantly in education, in upgrade of skills, and in digital services. Besides, some of the efforts that were made, for an example, under the Obama administration, were half-hearted when he formed or established the U.S. Competitiveness Committee. This was not a very serious effort. It did not have significant resources behind it. So in a sense, this is really to frame how the U.S., especially Trump administration, sought to externalize the rationale of challenges that were in effect domestically rooted, and cast China as a source of these problems. The fact that China started to dominate trade, Chinese manufacturing products were imported in the U.S., and there was a very deep deindustrialization in certain areas of America's economy. Now, the Trump administration has used China's trade surpluses vis-a-vis the U.S., the World Trade Organization, and the fact that a lot of companies, American companies, have offshored as the main cause of the troubles that America has been contending with. And he conflated this with his own personal views about how the world should be ordered and how other countries ought to conduct their public policies. This, in my view, is an outcome both of idiosyncrasies and the influence of cronies that he has surrounded himself with. And soon after his inauguration this year, he wasted no time and announced far-reaching executive orders. And these are too numerous to count. Some were announced and cancelled, some announced and put on ice, which suggests that there is no systematized way of thinking about the world. And on trade, one sees this, if you like, this schizophrenia in how, for an example, the USTR, Robert Lighthizer, maps out America's problems in the face of a growing China. It's a very systematic analysis of America's declining exports, how other countries' export profiles relative to the US have grown over time, and in particular focusing on China, presenting case studies of how in Trump's first administration, how they dealt with Mexico and Canada, how they negotiated trade deals with other countries, oftentimes using the G20 summit to force agreements on trade. So there is a philosophy, and if you like, this philosophy can be characterized as Trumpism, and is different from Trump, the person. So this is a philosophical formulation of those who have worked with him and who have tried to appropriate his thoughts and ideas into some kind of a normative framework that projects itself as credible in the world, when he himself is in fact more of a deal maker, a transactionalist, guided less by normative framing of the world or of public policy, and rather by the contingencies of the time, and also by how he feels about a particular issue, based on the discussions he would have had with his cronies and with others. So in the executive orders, he announced 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico to address, I quote, extraordinary threat posed by illegal aliens and drugs, including deadly fentanyl. Now, if you pause there, if you read the classical textbook case of what could be taken as a normative rationale or justification of Trump's thinking on trade in the work of Robert Lighthizer, much of this doesn't appear. Tariffs are used in the, in Hamilton's sense as about promoting aggregate wealth vis-a-vis trading partners, as promoting your relative economic weight vis-a-vis country B, and as correcting trade imbalances. And this has different expressions at the basic level to build infant industry, and at the strategic level to build competitiveness in high-tech sectors. So it's kind of wearing a dandy clothing, when in actual fact this is not how Trump calculates the uses of tariffs. He sees tariffs in very narrow political terms rather than in purely in mercantilistic way. That is not to say he would not use them for mercantilism, but that's not the only source of his register in using tariffs. So under his administration, the U.S. uses tariffs simply to as a leverage to achieve political outcomes. He may use them also as a leverage to achieve economic outcomes, but economic calculus is not the sole reason for tapping into tariffs. Now I'd like to quote one of his executive orders in the White House communication on the eve of imposing tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. He said, tariffs are a powerful, proven source of leverage for protecting the national interests. The idea of national interest is obviously expansive. It has no definable boundaries. It's left to a country to determine what its national interests at a particular point in time. Now, with all this background, this backdrop, and again, just to remind that the U.S. Has been changing its toolbox for some time now, certainly for the past 30 years or so, and more so post-global financial crisis. And if you want to plot the period, it's when China and the U.S. during the Obama administration had a tariff tiff over automotives, and there was a flurry of cases at the WTO at the time. And this, of course, evolved, and this signified a point at which I think the strategic dialogue fell apart. It no longer had any strategic content to it. The relationship was marked by mistrust, and enter Donald Trump, where the relationship took on a new phase that was highly transactional. And the Chinese quickly read this, and they would string the US along. For an example, when they when they negotiated the phase one, the first phase of the trade agreement, and it remained unsigned, remained unimplemented, and Trump is not simply going to go back to those agreements and say, let's start where we ended. He will look for other aspects of the relationship where he can use leverage to obtain outcomes that he thinks are critical for national interests. Now, with all of this, the US clearly is not going to play ball in the World Trade Organization. It's very clear also in Lighthizer book, as well as in his many other writings. It's fairly clear in Trump's articulation about the international institutions, and as we know, he has pulled out the US from some of those, has put question marks on others, defunded some others. I've argued that the US, and I might be proven wrong, maybe tomorrow, will not pull out of the WTO. In the build-up to the elections, and when Trump came to office, there was a lot of anxiety about America pulling out of the World Trade Organization. Pulling out of the World Trade Organization is to leave a theater where Trump or where America can use leverage. And there are plenty of things that happen at the WTO beyond the core agenda, or the files that are being negotiated, the issues related to sanitary and phytosanitary measures, customs valuation, intellectual property, which is a major interest of the US enshrined in its constitution. So I just don't see the US walking away from a very sound legal institutions, notwithstanding that the dispute settlement mechanism is partly functional or dysfunctional if you refer only to the appellate body. So I don't think the US is going to leave the WTO. Rather, it may frustrate its agenda. It may use it as a theater to contest various agenda issues that it doesn't like and assert those it wants to see the WTO taking on board. Now, under Trump 1, I was not at the WTO. The trade negotiators are not pure politicians. They are also technical, and they want to engage on the technical detail of what is being negotiated in the WTO, but also in the committee work, where a lot of technical work takes place. Under the Trump administration, we did not have traction on some of the contentious issues in the WTO. For an example, the restoration of the appellate body. It didn't move anywhere. What the Trump administration did, however, was to engage, was to be in the room, was to be available, was to try and explain itself. And then in the last days or weeks of its office, kind of threw a grenade in the form of the national security exceptions that the Americans wanted to find a political solution to. and they explicitly said, we want a political solution to this. Now, it's very rare for negotiated issues to be framed in such terms in the WTO, and I suspect that this will be more so in the advent of the Trump administration. So there will be a lot of muscling in and seeking political solution to specific issues. So the dispute settlement mechanism remains in paralysis. Several disputes are still unresolved since this was paralyzed back in 2017-18 in the first term of Donald Trump. In 2022, I think around June, the ministers were meeting in Geneva under the auspices of the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO, instructed members to go and find a solution, essentially to undertake processes that would lead to a reformed dispute settlement mechanism to fix this dysfunction. They worked for 18 or so months without a solution. They missed the deadline. The deadline was December 2024. December came and December disappeared, and we're in February. A ministerial instruction was not carried out, was not fulfilled. And that tells you something about the waning integrity of the institution, where ministerial instructions can willy-nilly be ignored. Now, there are several challenges that face the World Trade Organization. I really believe that the institution is at a crossroads. This year marks 30 years since it was founded back in 1995 when the actual founding agreement was signed. It's 80 years since the Bretton Woods institutions were founded, since GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, was founded. The template that was constructed back then, and you could include very well the template that was redesigned in 1995, is no longer fit for purpose today. It was constructed for a different world that has changed in dramatic ways, not because Trump arrived on the 1st of January 2025. The WTO has been going through a structural crisis. The negotiations stalled for over 20 years, with or without Trump. So there has not been traction on the core negotiating files on agriculture, on fisheries subsidies negotiations, and on various other issues. The e-commerce moratorium that was agreed in 1998 remains unresolved today. I won't go into the specific negotiating issues. I would just say that since, if you look at the developments since the 2000s, developments after the global financial crisis, the global economy has shifted in vast ways, with services and digital services overshadowing trade in goods, investments becoming a critical part of global value chains, and small and medium enterprises playing an active role in international competition. Climate-related risks have also intensified, with countries undertaking major investments in the green sectors, while the old problems of agriculture and food security became worsened by growing climate risks and natural disasters. Now, the WTO is simply unable to respond to these new challenges. The organization existed for a world where trade in goods was what we knew best. Of course, it does have an agreement on services, but that framing of services has been overtaken in major ways by digital services. The industrial economy or the production sector has shifted markedly to the intangibles. I mean, if you look at the growing value of investments in the intangible economy, R&D, AI, design, patents, imaging, etc., things that we cannot touch. And these are becoming the most valuable components of even goods that we utilize a lot today. The most valuable component of Tesla would likely be a computerized system. Even when you go to mining, to the mining sector, you go to the primary sectors. The computerized digital systems are becoming an important component that drives production. This is also true of the public sector. Countries have digital public infrastructure. India has announced one more recently. The UK is talking about an AI strategy. And so there's a growing emphasis on digitalization, on AI, digital services. The WTO has no rule-making system or process to respond to these new challenges. Because with tariffs, if you sell this phone to me, you're sitting here as a company producing this cell phone, I'm in South Africa, there is an HS code that will tell you how to levy tariff on a physical product. And if I sell this product on, it's no longer new, it's a second hand. But for many digital content, they don't, they have scalability, meaning you don't use them once, they can be used many a times. You can't say, I'll sell you a second-hand Microsoft Office or an Adobe suite. So it makes it very difficult to levy tariffs on digital services or those digitizable products that are sold via digital e-commerce, because you have to assign a rule of origin, and some of these, for an example, have updates where you either could pay for an update to upgrade it, and it's built into the initial contract. Would the taxman re-tax it again? Some are subscription-based. When your subscription ends, the thing ends. Some are for rental. So this creates a minefield in the area of rulemaking in the digital services. However, there is a lot of value that is accumulated in this area of trade that is captured by a few countries, the advanced industrial economies. But this value is not only just generated in advanced industrial economies, it's generated elsewhere as well in the developing countries. So those countries are unable to capture this value in the form of revenues. So this presents a challenge in how we approach the capturing of rents or value out of the fact that digital services have blossomed and corollary, you've had with dematerialization, it means that the things that countries use to tax, if a box that has a Microsoft Office CD arrives, it could be taxed at the border, but that tax disappears and there's less tax revenue in those countries. So these are some of the real challenges that the WTO, that the world faces, but the WTO is unable to respond to. These tensions have given rise to what has become known as plurilateral initiatives, where a subset of countries in the WTO want to enter into agreements outside of the WTO on investment facilitation or e-commerce, and then bring these agreements back to the WTO to incorporate or annex them and apply. Some would apply to the benefits would accrue to members only, and some the benefits would be on a most favored nations basis. Now, I think in light of all of this, it's very clear that things cannot stay the same. It cannot be business as usual at the WTO. The organization has to reform. Such reform need not be hitched to America's frames or America's conceptions of how multilateral institutions should be. As I indicated earlier, the WTO has always faced structural tensions or structural difficulties. It needed to reform anyway. And the Trump administration provides almost an impetus to undertake the reform measures that the institution should have been undertaking to address its structural challenges. I would propose that such reforms could be oriented towards achieving fairness in trade and meaningful development outcomes. The idea of fairness and equity is no longer specific to developed countries. It has also been appropriated. It's no longer specific to developing countries. It has also been appropriated by developed countries, in part to address the structural dislocation domestically, the reality that you have magnets of wealth in tech and finance centers and massive exclusions in areas that used to thrive industrially. And these countries are thinking about social or socio-economic inclusion. In the US, the idea of inequalities had no currency at all 20 years ago. If you talk about inequalities, there was no seriousness. You wouldn't be taken seriously. But studies on inequality have gained currency more and more because the reality is bubbling beneath the surface and spilling over to the public square to redefine politics in the US and how the US relates with other countries. So the idea of fairness and equity may very well be appeal to America if the WTO, if this is one of the things the WTO will pay attention to. For developing countries, the organization needs to meet the meaningful development outcomes. You would recall that the Marrakesh Agreement made a very clear, simple point about the need for the WTO to generate high standards of living, to improve standards of living, to achieve sustainable development, and to ensure that there is a steady rise in income, as well as to promote employment creation. It's very difficult to measure whether the WTO has indeed achieved all of this. We can say that as a result of globalization, many of the of the world's citizens have become better. But these are largely concentrated in Asia, and mainly China and India. Much of the world's citizens, much of the world's poor have not seen noticeable benefits as a result of globalization. But we've also got to understand that China powered its growth using fossil fuels. So we've got to be careful how much of China's model we hoist as a standard, because that's the reality. But that's a discussion for another time. Crucially, though, the WTO reform should seek far-reaching improvements in its legislative, that is, rulemaking function, its judiciary aspect, that is, the dispute settlement mechanism. And there are various proposals or ideas that float around, including a two-track or a two-lane system, if you like, where those countries that don't want to be bound by a dispute settlement or want to be users of the system can self-select or can exclude themselves from the beginning, but you can only select once. And those that they want to embrace the system in its totality, they are bound by it. But the judiciary aspect of the system will need to be fixed, and the final element is the deliberative function, which is expressed through the knowledge sharing and discussion of issues by members. Those issues they consider important. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on the dispute settlement. I'll make concluding points. Before I do that, on the judiciary reform, it will be amiss of me not to highlight that, of course, you have the multi-party interim arbitration arrangement that 54 countries, and if you exclude the EU, if you take the EU as one, that's about 27 countries or 28 members of the MPIA. It's still largely untested. It's meant to be a fast track, arbitration in a box, if you like. All the things that are in section 25 of the dispute settlement understanding with respect to arbitration are kind of embedded in the MPIA, but with all the structures and systems to expedite the arbitration process. Some countries are skeptical of this, some are not, some are quite keen, and the members are diverse. Obviously, they are developed and they are developing members. To conclude, I'll make the following points. There's a lack of clear normative grounding in Trump's presidency. There's no coherent narrative. We create the narrative for him. There is Trumpism, which he might not associate himself with, which is an attempt to hew a philosophy from the actions that he is taking, but recast them to serve particular interests that seem credible and that constantly dialogue with a core domestic constituency in the US to cement the hegemony of the Republicans in that constituency. Regarding the WTO, I think in my sense, the stage is set for China, US, and EU contestation. It will take a while before the WTO settles in a new temperature brought in by the Trump administration, because Trump 1, Trump 2 may not be the same as Trump 1. So in that light, we need to reimagine the WTO in a changing world, and this requires strategic foresight, ability to anticipate change, and readiness to adapt to new realities. Second, looking forward, the WTO will need to balance the immediate negotiating agenda or rethinking it altogether with a forward-looking vision that promotes international cooperation. In so doing, it must have a credible reform agenda that accommodates some of the US core interests. To do so, it will have to balance development, fairness, and equity on the one hand, with the retooling of the WTO towards possibly, as others argue, plurilateral rule-making. South Africa is not in favor of the plurilaterals because it sees them as leading to the fragmentation of the system. Yet core issues related to how the WTO makes decisions, the responsibilities of members to the vitality of the organization, the role of the Secretariat, and the deliberative functions of the WTO should equally receive attention. I think we've got to appreciate that multilateral institutions are not perfect, but they remain our best hope to tackling global challenges. We live in an uncharted territory. I don't think it's by accident. We are here and trying to figure out different pathways to reconfiguring these global institutions. The future is still foggy, but we've got to be alert to the fact that interdependence and international cooperation embedded in multilateral institutions is the best possible compact for humanity and for a functioning and stable global economy. Thank you. Okay, there's a hand there.
Thank you for that. Three questions briefly. To what extent did the rise of Xi Jinping and the world warrior diplomacy change or rather accelerate the clash between the US and China? Because if you note, during Hu Jintao's presidency, China was a bit late there, but when Xi Jinping comes into power, he really transforms China in a way that I think for the West they were not prepared or didn't see it coming. And then secondly, for you in the WTO, do you see China's influence at play? Like, do you have any sort of examples where you can feel that the power dynamics have changed and China is asserting its influence? And then thirdly, for many African countries, South Africa seems to be the only one that seems to be actively engaging with WTO, especially on a dispute settlement, but even on other general like committee and so forth. Why do you think this is the case? Is there a general reluctance within African countries to participate? Or what is the dynamic that makes South Africa seem to prioritize or care so much about WTO, whereas the rest of Africa seems to be laid back? Yeah.
Okay, let me start with the last. This has to do really with resources. For an example, in the WTO, there are 2 countries that have ambassadors dedicated to the WTO, 2 African countries, only 2, it's Nigeria and South Africa, and with staff complement dedicated to the WTO. You don't find this with many countries because of resources. Countries have to make calculation where to put. The Geneva mission is extremely expensive. It is very expensive for us as South Africa. It's a very expensive mission. So many countries would have their delegations covering both the WTO and the UN, and oftentimes focused at the UN. So it's a resource constraint. It's an objective reality that it's a calculation countries make because they have limited resources. I think if they were to have more resources, I see some. I mean, I think Kenya is kind of starting to also put more people in the WTO, but it's a very difficult thing. In the dispute settlement, and I'm amazed across the different issues that still you have African experts who participate in committees or in the African group processes, despite their resource limitations. For an example, our focal point, I think, on disputes is Liberia. The coordinator of the Africa group is Chad. The coordinator for agriculture is Nigeria. So we try to spread around as much as possible, but always try to say those countries with a bit more resources must carry more of the weight because of just the realities. I think you're spot on. I think the emergence of President Xi shifted the tempo in the West because of his determination to boost China's rise. He was talking about the China's dream. He was harkening back to the century of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars in the 1840s and the various unfair treaties that China had to sign with foreign countries. He was talking about the dream of China as to advance itself technologically, financially, but he was always careful not to appear or to sound as if China wants to take the place of the US, because I think the Chinese understand that with leadership comes with responsibility, and that responsibility is financial, is security, and China still has unfinished business in overcoming socio-economic cleavages within China. And so in the WTO, China doesn't project its influence. They're very scripted, by and large, focused on their interests. Slowly, they are coming out, but not in aggressive forms. So they kind of in an awkward space where they know that they are being watched. They don't want to upset the US too much, but on dispute settlement, they have pushed hard against the US because they have clearly identifiable interests that they want to be resolved through the system. And remarkably, China has renounced its claim to special and differential treatment officially in respect of some of the G90 proposals that carried special and differential treatment, asks from the least developed and developing countries, about 90 of them, asked to from the advanced industrial economies. These were not being resolved because developed countries were saying, China claims to be a developing country. There's no way we can offer special and differential treatment that is going to be abused by China. And then China said, okay, officially, we renounce our claim. Let's see if you're going to act. So we'll see if developed countries act. My view is that it was an excuse in the first place. They will not make a move to resolving those.